Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the 352nd Artillery Regiment. The morning on the Normandy coast began as any other. A thin, damp mist hovered over the English Channel, shrouding the world in gray silence. The air was cold, carrying the familiar scent of salt and wet earth. It was just after 5 a.m. Another watch, another day of tense waiting. Through his binoculars, as the first faint light of dawn struggled to pierce the horizon, the sea began to shift. It wasn't a tide, and it wasn't a change in the weather. It was something impossible. A dark line had appeared where the ocean met the sky, a smudge that kept growing, sharpening, multiplying. This was no fleet. It was a city of steel, a floating metropolis emerging from the mist, stepping into history. At that moment, before a single Allied soldier had set foot on the beaches below, before Omaha or Utah were even names anyone knew, Richter understood that the Reich was about to drown. To grasp the shock of that morning, one must imagine the mindset in fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From Norway to the Spanish border, German engineers had built the Atlantic Wall, a chain of concrete and steel bristling with guns, meant to be an impenetrable barrier against invasion. In the minds of the high command and through the propaganda soldiers were fed, it was proof of the Reich's strength. Richter, a professional soldier and veteran of the Eastern Front, could distinguish propaganda from reality. At 32, he remembered a different Germany and had been molded by the fire of war. Pragmatic, attentive, and deeply weary, he commanded an artillery battery whose formidable cannons rested in concrete casemates a few miles inland from the beaches soon to be named Omaha. From his observation post, a bunker set into a high bluff, he had a clear view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men drilled, calculated firing solutions, maintained their guns, and stared at the great emptiness of the water. The conversation always returned to the invasion, D-Day, the day of days. But when and where would it occur? German intelligence insisted the main attack would hit the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing of the Channel and the logical target. Normandy was considered a sideshow, perhaps a diversion, but not the main event. It was a dangerous misjudgment, the result of the Allied deception Operation Fortitude, which left Normandy underdefended. Richter's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was stronger than most in the area, but still only a shadow of the forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. It was a mix of veterans from the East, like Richter himself, and many young conscripts or older reservists. Brave and dutiful, yes, but not the stormtroopers of 1940. They were tasked with holding a line stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was a patchwork, not a solid barrier. Many bunkers were unfinished. Minefield had gaps, and the vast distances meant even strong positions could be bypassed. Richter knew this. He had seen the shortcuts local farmers still used, the blind spots in the fields of fire. Against a determined assault, he was skeptical. In the weeks leading to June, tension had become almost tangible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, assigned to strengthen the defenses, had overseen the placement of millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles on the beaches. Soldiers called him Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood what Berlin's high command did not. If the Allies weren't stopped on the beaches within 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power would devastate any reinforcements. The first day was everything. But on June 5th, the weather turned. A storm blew in with high winds and rough seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted that an invasion would be impossible for days. Many senior officers relaxed, convinced they were safe. Rommel himself had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, leaving the coast unattended. So Richter stood watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6. The storm had passed, but the sea remained rough. No one expected anything unusual. Then he saw it, a flicker in the gray. He raised his Zeiss binoculars, and his slow, steady heartbeat of a night watch suddenly raced. It wasn't a flicker. Hundreds of ships, and more still behind them. He scanned left and right. Everywhere the same. The sea was a mass of dark, threatening shapes. Cold dread crept along his spine. like staring at a problem he could not solve. German intelligence had estimated 3,000 vessels at most for invasion, an enormous number. But this defied comprehension. What Richter was seeing defied comprehension. He tried to count the ships, but it was a futile task. Instinctively, his mind began to sort them. The massive silhouettes of battleships and cruisers emerged first. Swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circled them like wolves around a prey. And then there were the others, countless landing craft of every shape and size, packed so tightly they resembled iron filings drawn to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image hadn't changed. If anything, it grew sharper as the sun rose. Later, the official tally would place nearly 7,000 vessels in operation, drawn from 8 nations, the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to Richter, this wasn't a statistic. It was a tangible presence, bending the horizon itself. It was an industrial declaration, so immense it rendered everything he knew about warfare obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had answered with a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hands slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the line was tired, dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships, Oberleutnant. Possible raid. Stand by." "No," Richter said, his voice tight with urgency. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. Thousands. The entire sea, horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." A pause. Disbelief. Richter could almost hear the man imagining him as a hysterical junior officer spooked by shadows. "The sea conditions aren't suitable. Reports show your numbers are wrong," came the response. "For God's sake, look at the sea." Richter shouted, his voice cracking. He slammed the phone down in frustration. Too vast to believe. He tried another line to regimental headquarters. "Sir, the invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that instant, it felt like an understatement. "Are you certain?" the Major asked skeptically. "The weather?" "The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major. It's sitting in the English Channel, asking permission to open fire." This time, urgency broke through. The chain of command was paralyzed by a failure of imagination. Plans, maps, intelligence reports, all erased by the reality floating just miles away. While Richter watched the fleet, High Command remained distracted by reports of parachutists inland, convinced that was the main attack. No one was looking at the sea. Richter did not wait. He shouted orders to his men. Awakened by the commotion, they peered over their positions, faces a mixture of awe and terror. They saw what he saw. Drills ended. This was real. Heavy shells were hauled from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The massive cannon barrels, silent for so long, slowly elevated, aiming toward the impossible fleet. Richter remained at his post. Binoculars pressed his eyes. He watched the landing craft forming up. He felt the vibration in the air, a low hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to throw the first stone. Just before 6 a.m., the order came. Engage at will. Relief and clarity replaced the paralysis of disbelief. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. Moments later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired, followed by a second and a third. The shells screamed over the water. Through his binoculars, Richter tracked them. Professional pride surged amid the dread. Plumes of water erupted around the fleet. A miss, then another. His men adjusted aim with disciplined precision. For a fleeting moment, they made their mark. Richter saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. A flash of orange, a puff of black smoke. From his perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and eventually sank. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like battle. Training mattered, but the feeling was short-lived. The fleet did not scatter. It did not slow. Gaps in the formation were immediately filled. Endless lines of ships pressed forward, an unstoppable iron tide. His guns fired again and again. Yet for every ship they harassed, hundreds passed untouched. A sense of futility washed over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to drain the ocean. He looked past his own impacts to the broader picture. Allied battleships, ships like the USS Texas, were now turning their massive 14-inch guns toward the shore. Then came the reply, a low rumble from across the water. Flashes of light leapt from the big ships, like lightning across a silent horizon. Seconds later, the air around him tore itself apart. The ground heaved, geysers of earth erupting from the fields. The Atlantic wall was being dismantled with industrial precision. Where was the German response? The Panzers? The Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies. Only Allied planes, fighters, bombers, transports ruled the air. Complete air superiority. German doctrine dictated armored counterattacks. Yet the nearest unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was frozen by confusion and the requirement for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally moved, it did so without air cover into a sky dominated by Allied fighter bombers and was decimated before reaching the front. In that moment, as his own guns fired and steel rained from above, Richter understood this was no ordinary fight. It was extermination. The Allies weren't maneuvering him. They were erasing him. This personal recognition of overwhelming force would define the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial might eclipse battlefield tactics is complex and fascinating. As the naval bombardment intensified, Richter's tactical mind shut down, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He no longer saw ships and soldiers. He saw the system behind them. Through trembling binoculars, he glimpsed the assembly lines of Detroit, factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of supplying hundreds of thousands of men on hostile beaches wasn't a miracle. It was sheer industrial output. The sky above teemed with endless sea, 47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew perhaps 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every German plane in the air, there were 40 Allied ones. It wasn't courage that failed Germany. It was the factories. Then there were the tanks. He knew the reputation of the German panzers, the Tiger and the Panther, feared for their technological superiority. Yet, that edge was strategically meaningless. Complex, costly, and slow to produce, each Tiger could not match the Allies' output. For every Tiger, the Allies rolled out dozens of Shermans. In 1944, the U.S. alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production never exceeded 2,000. The Allies didn't plan to win tank battles by quality. They planned to overwhelm through sheer numbers. This was the harsh new reality. The industrial equation of defeat, ideology, and willpower crumbled against these figures. Nazi propaganda had promised a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. Yet ideology couldn't stop a bomber, and willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Richter felt an almost spiritual despair. He and his men were competent soldiers, but they faced annihilation not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale beyond comprehension. The entire German army in the West, were like a finely honed sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome was never in doubt. Propaganda, home front faith in final victory. Lies. Not political lies, but mathematical ones. The High Command must have known the production charts. Yet they sent millions to fight a war they could not win. It's no surprise that in the final year of the war, psychological strain and this confrontation with impossible truth led to a rise in suicides among frontline officers. They weren't just facing American, British, and Canadian soldiers. They were confronting the unrestrained power of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed, theory became brutal reality. Naval bombardment reached a constant crescendo, a rolling thunder that shook the bunker. sending dust from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter saw the first waves of landing craft reach the shore. Higgins' boats dropped ramps, disgorging American soldiers into surf. German machine guns along Omaha Beach began to rattle, tearing into the first ranks. The 352nd Infantry Division exacted a horrific toll. For a moment, the defense seemed to hold. The Americans were pinned. But the industrial equation reasserted itself. Allied destroyers, witnessing the slaughter, steamed directly toward the shore, sometimes within 1,000 yards, scraping sandbars, turning their guns on the German bunkers and shifting the tide at Omaha. Simultaneously, new machines appeared. Dukas drove straight from the ocean onto the beach. Tanks advanced, some equipped with massive flails to detonate mines, the British Hobart's funnies, designed for exactly these defenses. The Germans had nothing to counter them. The struggle on the beach transformed into a methodical process of annihilation. German strong points were gradually silenced, systematically destroyed by naval shells, tank fire, and aerial bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, the 352nd Division would lose an estimated 1,200 men that day, a devastating portion of its fighting force wiped out in just a few hours. Richter's own battery had become a prime target. Shells landed ever closer. One of the gun pits was struck directly, sending a fireball skyward. Another gun was put out of action. Telephone lines went dead. He was cut off, his command shattered. He raised his eyes to the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the water, the first wave of landing craft was already giving way to second and third waves. Beyond them, the immense armada waited patiently, a ceaseless conveyor of men and material. Around 1,500 tanks would hit the beaches on D-Day alone. Though the fighting on the shore was fierce, the outcome had already been set. It was only a matter of time and weight of fire. The Normandy campaign would continue for 2 more months. The battles in the hedgerows would be brutal and costly, but they would change nothing. Every German tank lost was gone for good. Every Allied tank destroyed will be replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left a gap that could not be filled. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war was merely an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty, fear, or a patriotism divorced from reality. But the hope of victory had vanished. It disappeared in the dawn light of June 6. We often imagine the fall of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing collapse, ending in the battle for Berlin. But for those men in the Atlantic Wall, the end arrived in a single, horrifying moment of realization. It came when they saw a fleet stretch into the horizon, a sky filled with enemy aircraft, and a force that was not merely an army, but the full, crushing weight of modern industry. This was a new kind of war, fought not in the hearts of men, but on assembly lines thousands of miles away. And for one German officer, looking through his binoculars at a sea transformed into steel, it was a morning he knew it was over.